Me too. All right, got about 10 minutes to set up a further conversation that we'll have on a panel. So the mission for me in the next 10 minutes is just to lay the groundwork of the topic, and then we'll hopefully dive in a little deeper in a minute. So first of all, the question, of course, is why does transparency matter and why do we all care? And that actually begs the next question, which Brian started to highlight already, which is depends on what kind of transparency we're talking about. And yes, I think there is a reality that there is a lot of types of transparency that matter. What we find that often, or what I find that anyway, that most of the time is the topic of conversation when we talk about transparency is we're almost always talking about what I have labeled here first, which is the economic version of transparency. It's all about margin. That really ultimately answers the question, which is I have the buyer's hat on, right? Because when we're talking about transparency, we're mostly thinking of that of the buyer. The question from that economic transparency perspective is, of the check that I write you, Mr. Media Partner, Mr. Agency, whatever it is, how much of that money is actually in working dollars, right? How much of that actually is going into your pocket versus how much actually is going to accomplish the objective that I set out? That's only certainly one type of transparency. The second that I would propose is really important is the idea of placement transparency. When we're talking about media dollars and media placements, that's of course where is my stuff actually running. That could be what sites, could be what applications, what platforms, giving me the opportunity to understand and really answer the question, am I happy with where my media is showing up? Do I like that list of placements? And if not, of course, give me the opportunity to change that, right? So another form of transparency can be, again, placement. The third type that I list here is the idea of decision transparency, which ultimately answers the question, why are my ads showing up where they're showing up? So ultimately, if we are out there buying media and we have a lot of things that go into the decision criteria, a lot of data, a lot of models, a lot of algorithms, we ultimately would like to know why is it my media has ended up in those placements, and then we can get into, the idea of decision transparency. How much do I actually know about that? And then the fourth part of transparency that I listed was the idea of audience transparency, ultimately answering the question, am I actually reaching my target audience? Right? So again, what data was used translates into the people that I reach, and do I actually know anything about who I was reaching in my various media buys? So I would propose that those are the four key things that we think about. People might label them differently, but I would think those capture the big buckets of information that we're all looking for if we're a buyer of media to understand when we are making those investments. But I think a lot of people ask, that's great and all, but isn't actually margin the only thing I care about? And what's interesting is I think our industry is a little schizophrenic when it comes to that topic. This is certainly a hot button topic when we think about agencies and trading desks and the move into programmatic. Certainly all the agencies have come out, and there is the existing model of the non-disclosed, as Brian listed it, the transparently not transparent model. I think we're seeing all the agencies morph and evolve. And that's certainly an important topic, right? For all you direct buyers in the house here, certainly the understanding of how your agency is using your money is something very near and dear to your heart. But what I find interesting is that same question is not often asked about a lot of the media placements that are done more broadly. The thing I often like to point out is, how often have you asked Google what their margin is on a search click? Right? Think about that for a second. Or how often do you ask your ad network what margin they are taking and put it into their pocket? Right? I mean, these are other places where margin is being used in a way that isn't directly for working media. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that makes it bad, but it does suggest the question that margin is only sometimes being used as a really important, transparent conversation, and sometimes, again, is maybe more ignored than it should be. So I would actually then lead to the idea that the discussion of margin is probably not actually the most important thing. If that in our industry we are actually of the mindset that data is the new oil is one of those statements that we now see put out there all the time, if that's actually right, then where I'm running, why I'm running there, and what audience I'm reaching is actually far more important than whatever margin I might pay on any particular media placement. Because if the information arbitrage game that is certainly existing in the industry right now is the one that's actually being played, again, where data is the currency that matters, then if you're on the wrong side of that data arbitrage or that information arbitrage, you're probably more at risk than you are if you're paying some money where you don't want it to be paid. right? So if I don't have any history and I don't know anything about where my ads ran, why they ran there, or what audience I reached, then I am certainly at least as concerned about the lack of transparency I have in those things than I would be in margin as well. And I think really the core idea here, of course, is what are we actually after in transparency? And I think that the question, again, is behind the question. Our goal is not to just have transparency. What does that actually mean? What does that actually do for us? The argument I would make is what we're after when we think about transparency is, again, as the buyer, and of course as a seller you want to fulfill this objective, is making my media dollars as effective as possible. I want more media effectiveness. And if I shoot instead for the goal of 100% fully transparent, whatever that means to you, again, I'm probably losing sight of the bigger point of how do I make sure that every dollar I spend is a dollar well spent? And of course, the definition of media effectiveness is going to depend on what you are and what you're after. And so I'd argue that it could lead to all these different things, which is for some, the importance of viewability, which has already come up a couple times today, might be the thing I want most transparency on. For others, it could be fraud. For others, it could be the idea of addressability. Again, back to that who question of where I'm running my ads, because I want to add things to my, quote, DMP. I want to build that customer profile history. I want to get to that one persistent, unique identifier, and I want to know over time, how did I advertise to that person, and how do they react to different messages? I might care about that. For others, that's going to be more straight performance, a basic CPA metric, if you will, and I want to understand what are the placements that are most likely to lead to the best results. So again, core to me being is that if we shoot for 100% transparency as a buyer, you're going to be disappointed because there are times when having some less transparency in margin, or having some less transparency in placement, or some less transparency in decision-making criteria is all worthwhile. But what I want to do is understand which of these things to me are my hot button topics, such that I know which of the transparent topics that are most important. And ultimately, that is going to be the end. I'll let the panelists come on up and we can do that. But I just, again, close by saying, I think that from this kind of initial thought starter perspective is, we will do ourselves a good service by thinking about transparency across these different dimensions versus just margin.
All right. Well, now, it's okay.